You're watching the fourth lesson on percents. In this lesson, we'll be talking about getting values out of percentages. So most of these problems will revolve around getting a percent out of a total and trying to figure out how much or what the value is of that percent. So we can take a look at this. We know now how to convert percents into fractions. We know now how to convert percents into decimals and so on. So now we will get practice getting values from those percentages. For example, if I were to ask you what is 50% of $50, well, in your head, you'd probably already be able to guess or figure out that that's the same as saying $25, right? 50% of $50 is $25, so that's the value, right? Okay, well, you can also show it this way, right? Well, we're looking for some value, right, out of 50, that's the $50, which is the same as saying 50% or 50 out of 100. Well, I'm turning 50 into 100, right? So that's divide by 2. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top, and I divide by 2. And that'll give me a 25 as well. And so that's, in a nutshell, what we're doing. Here's an example. Last year, a store made 50.5% profit. The total sales made by the store was $10,000. How much profit or how much did the store make? How can I solve this question? Well, I have 50.5% profit. Okay, so we know that the easiest way to solve this would be to turn the percent, this percent, into a decimal and then multiply it by the total sales. Because we know the store sold $10,000 worth of whatever it's selling. Candy, chocolate, TVs, doesn't matter. And so if we turn this into a decimal, we can multiply it by the total sales. So we know that the stores made a 50.5% profit, which is the same as saying 50.5, because you know that 1/2 converted into a decimal is 0.5, so that's 50.5. Well, just turn it into a decimal. So now we have 50.5%. We turn it into a decimal like we practiced before. We take the decimal, we go 1, 2 to the left, and now we have 0.505. 0.505. That's our decimal. We take our decimal and we multiply it. So we take our decimal here and we multiply it by 10,000. So 0.505 times 10,000 gives me $5,050. So we can say the store made a profit of $5,050. Does that make sense, right? 50.5% profit, well, we can turn 50.5% to 50.5%. And that 50.5% we can turn into a decimal, which we get 0.505. And we take that 0.505 and we multiply it by 10,000. But this solution kind of requires a calculator, right? But what if you didn't have a calculator? What if I asked you not to use a calculator? Well, then we'd use mental math. And so I'm going to show you how to mentally solve questions like this so that you don't need a calculator. So to solve this mentally, break the question up into chunks. We are trying to find 50.5% of 10,000. Okay, well, let's break it up. Let's see if we can find 50% of 10,000. Well, we can do that easily. We know 50% of 10,000. Half of 10,000 is 5,000. So 50% of 10,000 is 5,000. So we already found the 50%. We found this part. Well, what's left is the 0.5%. And that's what we need to add. Well, 0.5% of 10,000, well, how do we find that? What is 0.5% of 10,000? Well, when I look at this question, I'll go, okay, well, what's a value I could find easily? Well, we can work our way down. What's 100% of 10,000? Well, that's 10,000. 100% of 10,000 is 10,000. Now we work our way down. Well, then what's 10% of 10,000? Well, that's the same as dividing this by 10, right? And we divided this by 10. Right? 100% of 10,000 is 10,000. But if I find 10%, I'm dividing this by 10. So I divide this by 10. And if you remember, if you divide by a number with a 1 and just following zeros, you just move the decimal spot one part over, right? So you end up with 1,000, right? You end up with $1,000 or 1,000, which is 10% of 10,000. Okay, well then what's 1% of 10,000? Well, I divided this by 10 again, right? 10 divided by 10 is 1. Well, I divide this value by 10 again. So then I take the decimal and I move it over another spot, which would give me 100. So now I know that 1% of 10,000 is 100. Well, we should know that 1 over 2 is half of 1. So if this is 1%, and I'm looking for half a percent, I can divide this by 2, but then I divide this by 2, and that'll give me 50. And that'll give me 50. Right? So in this case, I went 100% of 10,000 is 10,000. That's 100% of 10,000. That's all of it. 10% of 10,000, well, 100 divided by 10 is 10%. So then 10,000 divided by 10 is 10% of 10,000. So then I just move the decimal over one spot, which gives me 1,000. So 1,000 is 10% of 10,000. Okay, but then I'm finding 10% of 10%, or dividing 10% by 10, which would give me 1. That's 1%. Well, then I take the 1,000, which is 10%, and I divide that by 10, which moves the decimal over one spot, which will give me 100. So now I know 1% of 10,000 is 100. Well then, I'll just take the 1%, and I know 1/2 is half of 1, so I can divide 1 by 2 to get half a percent, right? I can divide this by 2 to get half a percent, which will then make this divided by 2, right? Divided by 2 to give me half of 100, which is 50. So now I know that 1/2 of percent of 10,000 is 50. And I just add it. I know what 50% is, which is 5,000. And now I know what half a percentage, which is 50. And I take 5,000 and I take the 50 and I put them together and I get 5,050. So what happens when we divide a number by 10? So pull out a calculator and just practice this. Divide, I just hit the number keys at random when I made this. Divide it by 10, right? You will get 3, 5, 7, 8.6. Okay, divide this by 10. Again, just smacking the keyboard at random. 7, 8, 9, 3, 4. Okay, divided by 10, you will get the answer. 7, 8, 9, 3, decimal 4. Try this one. 239,423, right? 239,423, just at random, divide that by 10 on your calculator. You will get the answer 2, 3, 9, 4, 2, decimal 3. What do you notice? Well, you should notice by now, from all the practice we've done, that when you divide a number by 10, well, it's the same number, just the decimal shows up in between the second last and last number, right? We had 35786, right? 35,786. We plop the decimal between 8 and 6, and we've divided by 10. We have 78,934. We take the decimal and plop it in between the 3 and the 4, and we have divided by 10. Same thing here, right? So whenever you divide a number by 10, you move the decimal to the left by 1. Just like with 100, right? You count the number of zeros, and that's how many decimals you move over. Using this rule, we can find any percent of any number with no calculator. What's 15% of 80? Okay, 15% of 80. I'm going to break this up. First, I'm going to find 100% of 80. Easy. That's 80. No math. Then, okay, well, I'm finding 10% of 80. Well, I turn 100 into 10 by dividing by 10. So then I have to divide 80 by 10. Well, 80 divided by 10 is 8. So 10% of 80 is 8. So we know this part, this 10% part, well, that represents the 8. Okay, well, what's left? How much is left? Well, 5%. We're looking for 5%. Well, 5% is half of 10%, right? We already know what 10% is. It's 8. So 5% is half of that. So what's half of 10% of 80? 4, right? Half of 10% of 80 is 4 because, sorry, 10% of 80 is 8. Well, 5% is half that. So 5% must equal 4. Okay, well, now I have the 10%, which is 8, and I have the 5%, which is 4. Well, I just add them together. 8 plus 4 is 12. And that's the answer, and that's 15% of 80. So practice these without a calculator, and then we can solve percents without a calculator. We can just divide by 10. So as you do this, practice just by dividing by 10, and you will get your answer just by using your mental math skills. Right? 21% of 45. Sorry, 21% of 45. Well, 10% of 45 is 4.5. Okay, well, if 10%, right, because I divided it by 10, put that decimal there is 4.5, then 20% is 2 times this, right? So then I multiplied this by 2 to get 9. So now I have the 20%. Now I'm looking for the 1%. Well, I already know that 10% is 4.5, right? So then I just move the decimal over one spot over to get 0.45. So then 21% is the same as saying 9.45. 21% of 45 is the same as saying 9.45. So in the textbook, these are the practice questions that'll help you. Hopefully this was helpful. There's a couple of steps involved, and it takes a bit of logic. So do these questions because they'll help you work through that logic, through that thinking, right? All you got to do is divide by 10 to get 10%, to get 1%. And if you know what your tens are, you just multiply your 10%, the value you got for your 10%, by the number of tens you have. And then you multiply the number you got for your 1% by the number of ones you have. And that's it. You have your answer.